The golden chandeliers sparkled above, casting a warm glow over the luxury restaurant filled with billionaires, celebrities, and powerful businessmen. Laughter echoed, wine glasses clinked, and every detail from the velvet chairs to the silver cutlery screamed wealth and exclusivity. And then the doors opened. A man in simple black clothes walked in, his hair slightly messy, his face calm but unreadable. He wasn't dressed in designer suits, he wore no expensive watch, no shining shoes. Immediately, whispers rippled across the tables. "Who let him in?" One man chuckled. "He doesn't belong here," a woman whispered to her friend, hiding a smirk behind her champagne glass. The man walked silently to an empty table. He didn't demand attention, didn't argue. He simply sat as if he had every right to be there. But the restaurant staff didn't see it that way. A tall manager in a pressed suit stormed over, followed by a waitress with sharp eyes. "Sir," the manager said coldly, "I think you're lost. This isn't a place for people like you." The man looked up slowly, his calm eyes meeting the manager's arrogant gaze. "I just want to eat," he said softly. That answer only made the room laugh. Guests smirked. One man muttered loudly, "He probably can't even afford the water here." The waitress leaned down, pointing a finger close to his face. "We don't serve drifters. Get out before we call security." Still, the man didn't move. He simply studied the waitress, then the manager, and finally the room full of mocking strangers. His silence was unnerving, almost more powerful than words. Finally, the manager snapped his fingers and two guards approached. The man stood slowly, his chair sliding back across the polished marble floor. For a moment, it looked as though he would leave quietly. The crowd smirked, believing they had won. But just as he reached the door, he stopped. He turned his head slightly, his voice low yet cutting through the entire restaurant. "You judge a man by his clothes. You mock him without knowing who he is. But remember this." He paused, his eyes sharp as steel. "The tables always turn." The laughter died instantly. The chandeliers above suddenly seemed colder. The guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing they had insulted someone far beyond their comprehension. And as the man walked out of the restaurant, a quiet dread settled in the air. Because though they didn't know it yet, they had just insulted the one man no one should ever cross. The restaurant returned to its noise and laughter after the man left. The guests chuckled, mocking him even more now that he was gone. "What a fool," one of the businessmen sneered, raising his glass. "Thinking he belongs among us." But hours later, when the night was at its peak and the music swelled, the doors of the restaurant opened again. The laughter froze. It was him. The same man they had mocked and thrown out walking back in with the same calm steps, his black shirt and simple jeans making him stand out even more against the gold and velvet around him. But this time, something was different. His presence was heavier, his silence sharper. The waiters froze, the manager's smile vanished, and the entire room shifted uneasily. He didn't speak at first. He simply walked through the center of the restaurant, every eye locked on him. The same waitress who had insulted him earlier stepped forward, her voice shaking though she tried to sound confident. "Sir, I told you, you are not welcome here." But before she could finish, a tall man from the back of the room stood up, his face drained of color. His hands trembled as he whispered, "Wait, I know him." The entire room went silent. The man who had been treated like dirt, the one mocked, insulted, and thrown out was someone far greater than any of them imagined. Stories about him spread and whispers his name tied to acts of quiet heroism, sacrifice, and uncheckable strength. The manager's face turned pale, sweat dripping down his forehead. The waitress lowered her finger, suddenly unable to meet his eyes. The businessmen who had laughed at him shifted in their chairs, now staring down at their plates. The man finally spoke. His voice was low, steady, but it carried through the chandeliers and silenced every breath in the room. "I didn't come here to prove myself to any of you. I came here to remind you of something you've all forgotten. Respect." He placed a card on the nearest table, something that carried more weight than gold, more power than any wealth in that room. And without waiting for an answer, he walked out once again. But this time, nobody laughed, nobody whispered. Nobody even moved. Because they all realized the truth. They had tried to humiliate a man who was far above them, not in wealth, not in status, but in dignity. And the shame would haunt them far longer than his silence ever would. The golden doors of the luxury restaurant closed behind him for the second time, but the silence he left behind was heavier than any thunderstorm. No one dared to laugh now. The card he placed on the table still lay there untouched, glowing under the chandelier's light like an unspoken warning. The manager hesitated, then slowly picked it up with trembling hands. His eyes widened. His knees nearly gave out. The card bore no name, no logo, just a single crest. A crest recognized only by those who dealt in power beyond money, beyond politics. It was the mark of a man whose influence stretched into places none of them could ever reach. The waitress who had insulted him earlier whispered, her voice cracking, "Who? Who was he?" The man in the back, the one who had recognized him, finally spoke. His voice was grim, heavy with fear. "His name is whispered in circles you don't belong to. He has no need for gold, no hunger for power, but when he appears, it means one of two things: salvation or judgment." Gasps echoed through the dining hall. The businessmen who had laughed at him looked sick, their faces pale as parchment. The socialites who mocked him now stared at the floor, their arrogance shattered. Suddenly, the restaurant doors burst open once more, not with the man's return, but with a group of stern, black-suited individuals. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They scanned the room with cold, calculating eyes. The manager stammered, Wait, what is this?" One of the suited men simply replied, "Inspection." Ordered by him. The restaurant's hidden truths began to unravel. Illegal deals, secret ledgers, corruption masked by chandeliers and wine, all of it dragged into the light. The very people who mocked him were now exposed, their secrets spilling like broken glass across the marble floor. The waitress, trembling, realized the bitter irony. They had tried to humiliate a man who didn't need their approval, but they themselves were now at his mercy. And somewhere outside, in the shadows of the city streets, the man walked alone, silent, calm, a ghost who had once again reminded the world that respect costs nothing, but arrogance always has a price. The chaos in the luxury restaurant grew louder as the suited investigators tore through books, safes, and secret compartments. The guests who once laughed now begged for silence, their faces drained of pride. But the weight of guilt hung heaviest on two people, the arrogant manager and the sharp-tongued waitress. Both of them kept glancing toward the golden doors, terrified he might walk through them again. And then he did. The doors swung open slowly. The man stepped in, not rushing, not threatening, just walking with that same unshakable calm. The room fell silent instantly. Every fork froze midair, every whisper died in throats. The manager staggered forward, sweat dripping down his temple. His voice cracked as he tried to explain, "Sir, I didn't know who you were. I only." The man raised a hand, silencing him without a word. His eyes shifted to the waitress, who stood stiff, trembling, her earlier arrogance gone. She lowered her gaze, ashamed. Finally, the man spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a storm. "You mocked me because of my clothes. You judged me because I walked in alone. You thought respect was only for those with wealth or power. Tell me, what did it gain you?" The waitress's lip quivered. She wanted to speak, but no words came. The manager, desperate, fell to his knees. "Please, forgive us." The man stepped closer, his shadow stretching across them under the chandelier's light. His expression didn't show anger, only disappointment. "I don't need your apology. What you owe isn't to me, it's to every person you've ever humiliated, every stranger you've ever treated as less than human." He leaned closer, his voice now sharp as steel. "Never forget this. Gold can buy food. Power can buy silence. But respect must be given freely. Lose that and you lose everything." He straightened, turning toward the silent guests. His eyes swept across the room, each person lowering their head in shame. Then, without another word, he walked toward the doors again. As he left, one of the investigators whispered to the room, "You should be grateful. If he wanted, none of you would still be sitting here." The golden doors closed behind him. And for the first time in the restaurant's history, no one touched their wine, no one laughed, and no one dared to speak. Because they had just learned a lesson they would carry for the rest of their lives. Never judge a man by what you see. You might be insulting the very hand that could save you. The next morning, the golden restaurant did not shine the same way. The chandeliers still sparkled, the velvet chairs still lined the floor, but the soul of the place had changed forever. Word had spread like wildfire. Newspapers whispered of a mysterious man who had walked in and exposed the rotten core of the city's most prestigious dining hall. Guests who once bragged about eating there now avoided its name in shame. The arrogant manager was gone, dismissed in disgrace. His reputation, once polished like glass, was shattered into pieces he could never pick up again. The waitress, who once wielded her tongue like a knife, stood quietly at the door, her eyes heavy with regret. For the first time in her life, she greeted every guest with humility, remembering the man's words echoing in her head. Respect must be given freely. Lose that, and you lose everything. The remaining staff moved differently too. Gone was the arrogance, the condescension. They bowed respectfully, served carefully, and looked each person in the eye not as customers, but as human beings. But perhaps the biggest change was in the wealthy guests themselves. Many who had mocked him sat in their mansions that night, haunted by shame. Some tried to drink the memory away, others tried to laugh it off, but none could erase the feeling that they had faced a mirror and hated what they saw. And somewhere, far away from the glittering lights of the city, the man walked the streets in silence. No guards, no luxury, no applause. Just him, his simple clothes, and the quiet dignity that no wealth could buy. He didn't return for revenge. He didn't return for reward. He returned only to remind the world of something they had forgotten, that power and wealth mean nothing without humanity. And though the restaurant still stood, it was no longer the same. For everyone who had been there that night, the lesson remained etched into their souls forever. Because they hadn't just seen a man walk in and walk out. They had seen the difference between arrogance and greatness. Weeks passed after that night, but the memory of the mysterious man refused to fade. The luxury restaurant, once the crown jewel of the city, had become a place of whispers, shame, and caution. People no longer bragged about dining there. Instead, they spoke of the night when arrogance was shattered by dignity. But the owners of the restaurant could not rest. Their empire had been built on pride, on exclusivity, on the belief that only wealth defined worth. Now, all of it was collapsing. The manager's name was ruined, the staff worked with fear, and the city's elite stayed away. Desperate, the owners decided on one last act. They would seek out the man. They would beg for forgiveness. And maybe, just maybe, they could wash the stain off their name. They searched through networks, called in favors, even hired private investigators. Yet every path led to silence. No address, no phone, no record. Only stories. Until one evening, on a quiet street corner far from the neon lights of the city, they finally found him. He wasn't in a mansion. He wasn't surrounded by servants. He was sitting on a wooden bench near a small food stall, eating a simple bowl of noodles. Children laughed around him. A street vendor greeted him warmly, and stray dogs lay peacefully at his feet. The owners approached nervously, dressed in their finest suits, their pride stripped away. The oldest among them spoke first, bowing his head. "Sir, we came to ask for forgiveness. The way you were treated in our restaurant, it was shameful. Please, allow us to make it right. A dinner in your honor. A statue. Anything you ask." The man put down his chopsticks slowly and looked at them. His eyes weren't angry, they were calm, almost sad. "You still don't understand," he said softly. "Forgiveness is not something you can buy. Respect is not something you can decorate your walls with. You cannot fix what is broken by offering gold." The owners swallowed hard, their suits suddenly feeling heavier than chains. One of them stammered, "Then, what do we do?" The man stood up, his presence towering though he wore nothing more than his plain clothes. He looked at them as though peering straight into their souls. "Change," he said, "not for me, not for your business. For every person who walks through your doors. Rich or poor, powerful or weak, treat them the same. Give them dignity, not because of who they are, but because of who you are." The owners lowered their heads in silence. His words carried more weight than any law, more truth than any sermon. Without waiting for a reply, he turned and walked down the quiet street. No guards, no cars, no spotlight. Just a man disappearing into the night. The owners stood frozen, the sound of children laughing in the background. And in that moment, they finally understood. They hadn't been visited by a stranger. They had been visited by a lesson, one that would echo through their lives until their final breath.